Hello friends, my name is Katja and you are welcome to my channel. I found this old parasol on eBay. I had been looking for an affordable foldable parasol that I could restore and this fit the bill. The silk cover is dirty and has some holes. The inside is more damaged. The lining is completely shattered. However, the mechanism is completely functional. The parasol folds at the center like this. This is typical for so-called carriage parasols. And before anyone comments, museums aren't interested in ratty old parasols. Why? Because all museums have a limited storage and they prefer objects which are in good condition and the history of which is known. The first thing to do is to take out the cover and let's see if we can learn more about this parasol. The tips are probably ivory or some other bone. Unfortunately, several of them have broken a long time ago. When I started to look into the seams, I was surprised. The entire parasol cover has been sewn by hand. You can see this row of neat running stitches at the edge of the lining. Someone has also tried to patch the holes at some point. The ribs are made out of rattan and they are in good shape and they feel sturdy. The stretchers and other metal parts seem to be free of rust and everything moves well. I think this parasol is probably from the mid-1900s. Any newer parasols would have metal ribs and they would be machine sewn. Could this be older? Hard to know. The Rijksmuseum has two similar parasols dated between 1840 and 1865. They both have a handle made out of bone, but with very similar shapes and featuring fringes. The museum parasol also has a tip, which is missing a carrying loop. In this fashion drawing, the woman on the left is holding the parasol from the carrying loop. Perhaps the hook of the parasol somehow attached to the tip, allowing to carry the parasol like this. Parasols were a fashionable accessory already in the 18th century. However, the size and style varied. Regency parasols tended to be small, then the average size of the parasol grew a bit, until shrinking again during the 1840s. The 1850s and 1860s were all years of small dainty parasols, and many fashion prints and photographs from the period show fringed parasols. Most of the parasols stayed small up until the end of the 1880s, when the size of the parasols started to grow. However, if we believe Helsinki City Museum's notes, even in the 1881 the parasols were still made by hand, despite the sewing machines having existed for a while. Here you can see how both the cover and the lining have been attached to the frame. Look, there is an ostrich feather trapped inside the canopy. It must be from a hat and caught in either during the making or later through one of the first holes. The top of the canopy has been sewn to the top of the frame and there seems to be a bit of glue to keep the canopy firmly in place. I think that this parasol used to have a tip, but it has broken off at some point. Next, I unpicked the decorative fringe. I had this idea of saving the fringe and using it for my restored parasol. I got the fringe out intact. Next, I had to wash it. However, let's do a little test to see how acidic the fringe is. I don't want to shock the fringe by changing the pH level too quickly. The pH level seems to be somewhere between 6 and 7, which is neutral, so everything is fine. Now, let's leave it to soak for a while. After about an hour of soaking, some gentle squeezing and rinsing, my fringe is as clean as I can get. Now let's try it. And apparently I forgot to wash the little tuft at the top. Now, this fringe is completely tangled and I need to straighten it before it dries. However, I started soon realizing that something was wrong. My hands and arms started itching and soon they turned red. I had not worn any gloves and my skin started reacting to some unknown substance. The more I thought about it, I realized that I didn't have any idea what chemicals were used to dye and treat the materials in the original parasol. Some Victorian popular dyes contained arsenic and other poisons that might not only cause skin irritation, but also cancer and other dangerous issues. I decided that I didn't want my new parasol having a poison fringe hanging in front of my face, so I quickly ditched the idea of attaching the old fringe to the restored parasol. I washed my hands thoroughly and they luckily recovered in a few hours. May this be a lesson for all of you. The Victorian fabrics and trims are best kept behind the glass in museum. Now, to get the pattern for the new canopy, I needed one intact piece from the original canopy. Here I could get very well acquainted with the way the seams were sewn. All the triangles were first stitched together with a row of running stitches. Then the seam allowance was folded to one side and a small tuck was made at the seam line. Another line of running stitches then reinforces the seam and I guess would make it pretty waterproof as well. Not that it is a good idea to take this silk umbrella in the rain, but I have seen a similar seam structure in modern umbrellas as well. However, I don't have any idea what this seam is called. If you know, write it in the comments. Before taking the pattern, I ironed the canopy piece. I traced the canopy piece through the pattern paper. The piece wasn't really symmetric, so I then folded the piece in half and cut the pattern out so that it became more or less symmetric. Just a little check that it looks good. Then it's time to look at some silks I have in the storage. I don't have anything that would match exactly, and who really knows what the color of this parasol was originally. I finally went with the basic white. I used the friction pen to draw the pattern pieces on the silk and cut them away. There were 8 pieces in total that formed the canopy. Now, I had originally thought I would sew this parasol by machine, but seeing that the original was hand sewn, I wanted to replicate that. So, instead of quickly whipping it up with my machine, I settled for some hours of hand stitching with a silk thread. Now I have joined the canopy pieces together in pairs using the running stitch. Now I'm folding the seam allowance to the right hand side and forming the little tuck with the first seam on the top of said tuck. One double check to make sure that I'm doing this right. I'm using pretty strong hand sewing silk thread for this. Now, where is my thimble? Now the canopy is almost done. Let's see how it fits. My canopy looks a bit too pointy. However, I decided to sew this on to see the fit a bit better. As you can see, I don't have those ivory tips on yet. The frame has little holes at the end and the tips were more like a decoration on the top. The canopy fits otherwise pretty well, but there is a bit extra fabric at the top. I decided to fix this by simply taking in a bit at the seams at the top. Luckily, there was no need to unpick anything. The little dot there marks the spot where the canopy meets the shaft. I'm now sewing a row of gathering stitches around the top. I add just a little bit of glue to the tip and then tighten the canopy around the tip of the shaft. Now I can attach the canopy back to the tips of the ribs. Now I must take care of the center. This gets another row of running stitches that gathers and tightens the fabric around the tip of the shaft. Then I wind the thread a few times around the shaft tip and attach the thread with a few stitches. This is as close as I can get to the original canopy tip. I noticed that one of the ribs had a small crack near the tip of the parasol. At this point I could still add a bit of glue to the crack and glue it closed. Luckily, it seemed not to affect the function of the parasol and the rib was nowhere near to cracking otherwise. Now, if I just can make these clips keep the crack closed. While the glue sets, I can make the lining. I have this silk sponge fabric meant for silk painting and it is perfect for the lining. I used the same pattern pieces that I used for the outer canopy. The original lining was sewn with simple running stitches, so it didn't take long for me to make this new one. Before attaching the lining, I have to attach the canopy to the ribs. I'm trying to keep my stitches pretty loose and go through the seam allowance so that these stitches don't show on the outside. Every rib is attached to the canopy in two places. Now it is time to add the lining. I folded the seam allowance in at the edge and pinned the lining in place. It is a bit loose at some places, but it is good enough for me. I go through the outer edge with the running stitch that attaches the lining. Then I attach the lining to the ribs. Here I do this slightly differently than in the original. I think that original sewing order must have been different because it allowed to sew the lining to the ribs similarly to the way I had attached the canopy. Luckily I could see the ribs and the stitches underneath through the sheer fabric and I sewed the lining to the stitches that I had used to attach the outer canopy. This worked well enough. Now, what to do with the center? The original lining was so shattered that I couldn't really figure out how it was put together. So I decided to wing it. I took a little keyring and passed it through the shaft. I then threaded the edge of lining triangles through the ring and sewed them in place. I ordered the new fringe from Etsy and here it is. I'm really happy because this is very similar to the original one. Now I only need to sew it on the edge of the canopy. I found an old broken umbrella and decided to use the metal tips to replace the broken ivory ones in the original parasol. These tips were a bit too long, so I shortened them with a middle saw. Since the canopy is already attached firmly to the ribs, these tips are more decorative than functional. Still, they take some of the strain and help this parasol last longer. Here is the finished parasol. Thank you for watching. Please help my channel by liking and subscribing. See you soon. Bye!